The place is New York City, and this is the eve of the end. Because even at midnight, it's high noon, the hottest day in history, and you're about to spend it in the Twilight Zone.
One decision nearly killed the Twilight Zone before it ever had the chance to become a television legend. Today, it's remembered as one of the greatest shows ever made. A series so influential that decades later, filmmakers and television creators are still copying ideas Rod Serling introduced in the late 1950s. But when the show first arrived, many executives believed it was too strange and too different from what mainstream audiences were used to. And that's when something unusual started happening. Actors begin appearing and then disappearing, episode after episode. Faces change constantly. Some leave after delivering unforgettable performances. Others vanish without ever getting a clear second moment in the spotlight. What actually caused all these exits? Let's get into what really happened. The idea that almost never got made. Before anyone could leave the Twilight Zone, there almost wasn't a Twilight Zone to leave. The series became one of the most influential shows in television history, but almost every step of its creation carried obstacles that could have killed the project before it ever reached audiences. The forces that nearly stopped the show from being made continued shaping its future for years, affecting everyone, from the actors who appeared on screen to the man responsible for creating the entire universe. Rod Serling was already one of the most respected writers in television by the late 1950s, having won multiple Emmy Awards for live dramas like Patterns and Requiem for a Heavyweight. But Serling had grown frustrated with something specific. Network censors and nervous sponsors kept stripping the social commentary out of his scripts whenever he tried to address racism, war, or political corruption directly. Sponsors pulled their advertising dollars from anything too controversial, and executives softened scripts until the message disappeared entirely. Serling realized something that changed television history. If a story about racism were set on a real American street, executives panicked. If the exact same story was set on a distant planet or wrapped inside a ghost story, nobody objected. Science fiction and fantasy became his disguise. He could write about prejudice, conformity, nuclear fear, and corrupted power, as long as the setting felt impossible enough that nobody thought it was really about them. The pilot episode, Where Is Everybody?, aired on October 2, 1959, and the show was not originally written with Serling himself as an on-screen narrator. Network executives actually used announcer Westbrook Van Voorhees to narrate the opening of that very first episode, deciding his voice fit the mysterious tone better. CBS executives reportedly considered other names too, including Orson Welles, before financial and scheduling realities made Serling himself the obvious and final choice. Audiences would not actually see Serling's face on screen until the very end of the first season, since the format had not yet been built around him appearing as a recurring on-screen presence. The show struggled to find a stable sponsor more than once during its run, and that instability set the stage for everything that happened next, both for the people who appeared in front of the camera and for the man who built the entire universe from behind a typewriter that rarely stopped moving. Here is what makes The Twilight Zone completely different from almost every other classic television show. The Twilight Zone was an anthology. There was no recurring cast returning week after week, no central family or workplace, no characters whose stories continued from one episode into the next. Every single week brought an entirely new story, an entirely new cast, and an entirely new world that usually ended in tragedy, irony, or a twist nobody saw coming. That structure meant every actor who appeared on the show was, in a very real sense, always leaving. They arrived for one story and departed permanently the moment the episode wrapped. This created a fundamentally different kind of departure story than something like a long-running family sitcom. Nobody negotiated contract renewals for a recurring role because there were no recurring roles to renew. What actually happened instead is more fascinating. Dozens of future legends passed through that door for exactly one appearance, and what happened to them afterward varied wildly. Some used the appearance as a launching pad into massive stardom. Others appeared once, delivered an unforgettable performance, and faded quickly from the spotlight for reasons that had nothing to do with talent. And running underneath every single one of those stories was the man who never really left it all until the very end. The writer who poured himself into 92 of the show's 156 total episodes and eventually walked away from his own creation completely depleted. William Shatner and the episode that almost wrecked his reputation. If there is one Twilight Zone story that proves a single 25-minute episode can define a career forever, it belongs to William Shatner. Before Star Trek existed, before Captain Kirk became one of the most recognizable characters in television history, Shatner appeared in two separate Twilight Zone episodes. The first, Nick of Time, aired during Season 2 and showed early signs of the intensity that would define his performances for decades. But the appearance that became permanently linked to his name was Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, broadcast in Season 5 in October 1963. Shatner played Bob Wilson, a man recovering from a nervous breakdown who boards a flight home and becomes convinced he sees a creature tearing apart the engine on the wing outside his window. Nobody else on the plane can see it. The episode was filmed inside an empty water tank, with the mock-up airplane section suspended roughly 30 feet off the ground, shot at the production's typical breakneck pace of just 3 days per episode. Director Richard Donner, who would go on to direct Superman and The Omen, later admitted the shoot had almost no time for deep conversations about artistic approach. His direction in the moment was often as simple as telling Shatner to deliver a line louder or faster, a reflection of just how compressed the production schedules really were on this series. During filming, Shatner and fellow actor Ed Burns staged a prank fight on the mock airplane wing specifically to stress out Donner, throwing a dummy off the set that crashed to the concrete below and briefly convinced the director something had gone horribly wrong. The performance could have easily tanked Shatner's reputation. A grown man screaming about a monster on an airplane wing that nobody else can see is, on paper, a recipe for ridicule. Instead, the episode became one of the most beloved and frequently referenced hours in television history, parodied everywhere from The Simpsons to Sharknado, and remade twice in later years, once for the 1983 Twilight Zone movie with John Lithgow in the role, and again for the 2019 revival with Adam Scott. Shatner has said publicly that even decades later, people still ask him if he sees anything on the wing of the airplane every single time he flies. Rod Serling, stepping into frame in a tailored suit to address the audience directly, became the single most recognizable image associated with the entire series. That presence would later define the Twilight Zone, shaping its identity as much as its stories did. But that version of the show almost never existed. The familiar opening, the calm voice guiding viewers into strange and unsettling narratives, was not the original plan at all. CBS initially leaned toward using established narrator Westbrook Van Voorhees for the pilot episode. His voice carried authority, gravity, and a ceremonial tone that suited traditional anthology storytelling. However, once tested against the evolving direction of the series, that same quality began to feel too rigid and overly formal for something intended to shift tone from episode to episode. The network started reassessing what kind of presence could properly frame stories that blended science fiction, morality, and psychological unease. At one point, CBS even considered a far more ambitious and expensive option: Orson Welles. Already one of the most iconic voices in American entertainment, Welles brought a level of prestige and recognition that would have instantly elevated the series. Yet, that prestige came with a cost that the production simply could not sustain. The financial structure of the show was already under pressure, and Welles's fee exceeded what the budget could realistically accommodate. What makes this detail genuinely fascinating is how invisible Serling remained for most of the first season as a physical presence. Audiences heard his voice opening every episode, but they did not actually see him on screen delivering those opening lines until the very end of Season 1. The show had not originally been written with Serling as an on-screen character the audience would recognize and wait for. That transformation from disembodied voice to the most iconic walking, talking symbol of the entire series happened gradually and was never guaranteed from the beginning. Future legends who passed through and never came back. Several names that later became enormous stars appeared briefly inside the zone and then moved permanently into completely different corners of entertainment history. Charles Bronson, years before becoming one of the defining action stars of the 1970s, appeared in a Season 3 episode called 2, playing one of the final two people left alive on Earth who slowly find an unlikely connection with the only other survivor. At the time, Bronson was still grabbing whatever film and television work he could find, years away from the international stardom that action films would eventually bring him. Carol Burnett appeared in the Season 3 episode Cavender is Coming, a comedic entry that history has not remembered as one of the show's stronger installments, but one that captured a future legend of American comedy early in a career that would soon explode with The Carol Burnett Show. Burnett's appearance is a reminder that the series pulled from every corner of the entertainment landscape, not exclusively from dramatic actors building toward serious film careers. Martin Landau appeared early in the show's run in the Season 1 episode Mr. Denton on Doomsday, playing a young gunslinger character years before his Academy Award-winning performance in Ed Wood and his role on Mission Impossible made him a household name. These actors did not leave the show because of conflict, contract disputes, or creative dissatisfaction, the way a recurring cast member might. They simply finished telling one specific story and moved on to the next chapter of careers that, in several cases, had not yet caught fire. Robert Redford appeared in a Season 3 episode called Nothing in the Dark, playing a wounded police officer who turns out to be a much more significant figure in the story than he initially appears. At the time of filming, Redford was still years away from the box office dominance and critical acclaim that would eventually define his career through films like Butch Cassidy and The Sundance Kid and All the President's Men. His performance in that single episode is frequently cited by film historians as an early glimpse of the quiet intensity that would later become one of his defining qualities as a leading man. None of these actors knew at the time that their brief stop inside Serling's universe would later be remembered as a notable footnote in careers that would eventually dwarf the show that gave them an early platform. The episode that almost got the show pulled off the air. Not every departure story in the Twilight Zone universe involved an actor walking away. Some of the most dramatic exits involved entire advertisers walking away from the show itself, and the consequences nearly ended the series years before its actual cancellation. By the show's second season, companies including Colgate-Palmolive Peet and the Liggett and Myers Tobacco Company pulled their advertising dollars entirely. The reason was simple. Serling kept writing episodes that touched political and social nerves that sponsors found too risky to be associated with. Network executives complained regularly about how dark certain plots had become and how heavily the show leaned into uncomfortable science fiction themes that, at the time, had not yet proven themselves reliably popular with mainstream audiences. Rather than softening his approach, the sponsor exodus seemed to harden Serling's resolve to keep pushing the show in the direction he believed in. He had built a reputation as Hollywood's so-called angry young man, specifically because of his refusal to back down from network and advertiser pressure. That reputation came at a real cost. The constant friction between Serling's creative vision and the business reality of a struggling sponsor situation created an environment of chronic instability that hung over the production for years. Well before the eventual cancellation, conversations even began. The show was actually pulled from the air entirely once before its true final ending. Before Season 4 was set to premiere in 1962, the production could not secure a sponsor at all. CBS executive James T. Aubrey made the call to remove the series from the fall lineup completely, replacing it with a comedy called Fair Exchange. That replacement show failed to find an audience, and in January 1963, Serling was invited back to his original time slot specifically because the network needed something, anything, to fill the gap that nothing else could fill. The show that almost died in 1962 limped back to life for one more chance, but the toll of those repeated near-death experiences had already begun reshaping the man at the center of it all. Most actors who appeared in the Twilight Zone appeared exactly once, told their one story, and disappeared back into the wider landscape of 1960s film and television. Burgess Meredith broke that pattern entirely, and the reason he kept returning reveals something important about how rare genuine creative chemistry actually was on a show built from scratch every single week. Meredith appeared in 4 separate Twilight Zone episodes across the show's run, a number matched by almost nobody else in the entire series. His most famous appearance, Time Enough at Last, cast him as a bookish bank clerk who survives a nuclear apocalypse only to discover, in one of television's most devastating final twists, that his shattered glasses leave him unable to read any of the books he now has all the time in the world to enjoy. That episode remains one of the most frequently cited and emotionally punishing endings in the entire history of the series. What made Meredith different from a one-episode guest star was not contractual loyalty, since no such ongoing contract existed in an anthology format. It was something closer to genuine creative trust between an actor and a writing staff that kept finding roles perfectly suited to his specific talents. Serling and the other writers clearly recognized that Meredith could carry an entire episode's emotional weight on his face alone, a skill that made him an obvious choice whenever a script called for quiet devastation rather than overt horror. Meredith's repeated appearances were never about a departure or a return in the traditional sense. They were proof that even inside a structure built entirely around constant turnover, certain creative partnerships found a way to persist anyway. This is the part that reframes the entire question of who left the Twilight Zone and why, because the most important departure story in the show's history belongs to the man who created it. Across 5 seasons and 156 total episodes, Rod Serling personally wrote or co-wrote 92 of them, while simultaneously serving as the on-screen host, narrator, and creative force steering every other aspect of production. For comparison, a modern streaming series running for 5 seasons might produce 65 total episodes across its entire run. The Twilight Zone produced more than double that volume, averaging over 30 episodes a year during a television era that demanded relentless, grinding output with none of the modern production breaks audiences take for granted today. Serling described the toll of that schedule with unusual directness in later interviews, saying that writing at that pace eventually made him lose perspective on what was actually good and what was bad in his own work. The exhaustion was not exaggeration or false modesty. By the time the show approached its final seasons, Serling was, by his own description and by accounts from people working alongside him, both physically and mentally drained in a way that had become impossible to hide from the people around him. Behind the scenes, the production was also absorbing a series of changes that affected quality in ways audiences could sense, even if they could not name exactly what had shifted. Different writers were brought in to handle scripts Serling no longer had the bandwidth to produce himself, including Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont, both of whom became central to the show's identity in their own right. But the balance and consistency that defined the show's strongest seasons became harder to maintain as the creative load shifted across multiple hands, working under constant deadline pressure. CBS announced the show's cancellation in January 1964. The final episode, titled Bewitchin' Pool, aired on June 19, 1964. Despite the exhaustion and the declining sponsor support, Season 5 still managed to produce several episodes now widely regarded among the strongest of the entire series, including Steel, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, and number 12, Looks Just Like You. The show went out while still capable of greatness, even as the man behind most of it had nothing left to give. The decision that cost Serling's family a fortune. When the cancellation finally came, Rod Serling responded with a kind of grace that surprised people who expected bitterness after 5 years of constant fighting with network executives over creative control. In an interview with UPI shortly after the cancellation, Serling said he genuinely did not blame CBS for the decision, despite admitting he never fully understood the exact internal reasoning behind it. He acknowledged something honest and a little painful. After 5 years on the air, he felt the show had started to take on what he called an aged look. That kind of self-aware acknowledgement from a creator about his own work is rare, and it suggests Serling understood the toll the relentless production schedule had taken on the show's creative freshness even before audiences or critics said so publicly. There was briefly a possibility that the series could survive on a different network entirely. Serling later revealed that conversations had taken place about a potential move to ABC, but he described ABC's apparent vision for the show in blunt terms, saying he got the impression they wanted a trip to the graveyard every single week. That phrase suggests ABC was interested in a much darker, more horror-focused direction than the blend of social commentary, irony, and science fiction that had always defined Serling's original vision. The deal never happened, and unlike the earlier near cancellation in 1962, this time there was no assurance the show would ever return in any form, not even as what Serling sardonically called a 5-minute commercial. When the show ended in 1964, representatives advised Serling to sell his rights to the series back to CBS entirely. At the time, the decision made a certain kind of sense. Syndication as a business model barely existed in any meaningful form in 1964, and nobody working in television at that point could have reasonably predicted that reruns of old shows would eventually become a permanent, profitable fixture of the entertainment landscape for decades into the future. CBS itself reportedly told Serling they doubted they would ever recoup the production costs of the series, framing the buyout as a mutually reasonable exit for everyone involved. Serling agreed. He sold his rights and walked away believing the show was, at best, a respected but ultimately closed chapter of his career. What actually happened next proved devastating in retrospect. The Twilight Zone went on to have an extraordinary afterlife in syndication, airing and re-airing for generations, becoming one of the most consistently rerun and culturally referenced shows in television history. Serling's widow, Carol, later estimated that the decision to sell those rights cost the family approximately $4 million in lost income, a genuinely staggering sum, even by today's standards, and an almost unthinkable one in the context of mid-1960s television economics. Serling's older brother, Robert, later reflected on the decision with a mixture of defense and sadness, pointing out that Serling was simply exhausted after 5 draining years, and that absolutely nobody in that era could have predicted the eventual success of syndicated reruns. Carol Serling echoed that same sentiment decades later, explaining that in that period, nobody believed shows would still be airing 50 years into the future because the technology and business model that eventually made that possible simply did not exist yet. The tragedy compounds further with one additional detail. Rod Serling did not live long enough to see the full scale of what his creation eventually became, passing away in 1975 at the age of 50, years before The Twilight Zone fully cemented itself as one of the most influential and frequently revived properties in television history. It is worth sitting with the scale of that loss for a moment longer. $4 million in the mid-1960s represented an almost unimaginable sum for a working television writer, even one as successful and respected as Serling had become. That money would have provided lasting financial security for his entire family across generations. Instead, the rights now belonged entirely to CBS, and every rerun, every syndication deal, every future licensing arrangement connected to the show generated revenue that flowed somewhere other than to the man who had personally written the majority of its most memorable episodes. What happened after Serling walked away? The end of The Twilight Zone did not end Rod Serling's career, but it changed the trajectory of it in ways that never quite recaptured what he had built during those 5 years. He went on to create another anthology series called Night Gallery, leaning into horror themes more directly than The Twilight Zone ever had. But Serling had dramatically less creative control over that production than he had maintained over his original creation, and the difference showed in how much input network executives exercised over the final product. He continued writing for both television and film throughout the rest of his career, including co-writing the screenplay for Planet of the Apes, a project that allowed him to continue exploring the kind of social commentary disguised inside science fiction that had always defined his best work. Serling remained a prominent social commentator and activist throughout this period, using whatever creative platforms he could secure to keep addressing issues like racism, war, and censorship, the exact themes that had originally pushed him toward science fiction as a disguise in the first place. He once described his frustration with the post-Twilight Zone landscape directly, noting that network executives barely approached him for new projects anymore, joking bitterly that he was hardly approached at all, except occasionally for a cigarette in the hallway when someone ran out. That joke carries real weight. The man who had once been one of the most powerful creative forces in American television, who had personally written 92 scripts for one of the most influential shows ever made, spent his final years watching opportunities shrink in an industry that had, in many ways, already moved on from him, even while his most famous creation kept finding new generations of devoted fans through syndication. There is a particular kind of loneliness embedded in that contradiction. While Serling struggled to land meaningful new projects in the final years of his life, reruns of The Twilight Zone were quietly building an audience he would never fully witness. Local television stations across the country picked up the syndicated episodes and aired them in late-night and weekend slots throughout the late 1960s and into the 1970s, slowly converting the show from a respected but modestly rated original broadcast into a genuine cultural institution. Serling occasionally appeared in interviews reflecting on the show's growing afterlife, but he rarely spoke about it with anything resembling triumph. By most accounts from people close to him, the dominant emotion was closer to weary surprise that something he had once worried would simply gather dust was instead becoming permanently woven into the fabric of American television culture, just without him owning any meaningful financial stake in that transformation. The story of who left the Twilight Zone is usually told as two completely different stories. One is about famous actors who stepped into the series for a single unforgettable episode before moving on to bigger careers. The other is about the exhausted writer who eventually walked away from the show he created and sold away a fortune that would have changed his family's future forever. But these stories are actually the same story told from two different angles, and that connection is the real reason The Twilight Zone produced both extraordinary careers and genuine personal tragedy simultaneously. The anthology format that let William Shatner, Charles Bronson, Carol Burnett, and Martin Landau pass through for a single transformative appearance and then move on to massive careers elsewhere was the exact same structural decision that exhausted Rod Serling into selling away $4 million of his own family's future. The format demanded constant, relentless turnover. New stories every single week. New casts every single week. No recurring characters to lean on for easier scripts. No established sets to reuse without rebuilding the entire emotional world from scratch. That turnover created opportunity for the actors who passed through and devastation for the man who had to generate fresh, meaningful content at that pace without ever being able to simply continue an existing storyline the way a normal series writer could. The brilliance of the anthology format and the burnout that ended Serling's ownership of his own creation were not separate phenomena that happened to coincide during the same 5 years. They were the exact same engine. The relentless creative demand that made every single episode feel fresh, urgent, and unlike anything else on television in 1959 was the identical demand that drained Serling completely dry by 1964. The show could not have become what it became without that structure, and Serling could not have survived owning that structure forever without eventually breaking under its weight. Understanding that connection changes how every individual departure story in this entire video should be read. Nobody really left the Twilight Zone cleanly. The format itself was built on goodbye, week after week, for 5 relentless years, until it finally said goodbye to the one person who had given it almost everything he had. The Twilight Zone gave the world unforgettable performances, launched careers that became legendary, and eventually consumed the very man who built its entire universe from nothing. Rod Serling walked away exhausted, underpaid, and unaware of what his creation would eventually become. The actors who passed through moved on to extraordinary futures. The show itself never really stopped haunting television history. Drop a like and subscribe for more deep dives like this.